Hello and welcome to season 14, episode 5 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I am Mark Bishop. Oh, my headphones just fell off on me.
You just got them like stuck on I don't know how you did that. You just got
I
them
don't know
stuck
how
on
I
the
did that
front
either.
of your face. That was ridiculous. That's almost impressive. I've never seen anybody do that with a set of headphones before. Um, we are, of course, reading Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, this time going back to America, talking about Southern conservatism with Randolph and Calhoun. Interesting figures, controversial figures now in American history. Very pro-slavery figures is who we're talking about today. What do you think of
Yeah,
his
and
yeah,
and I mean, yeah, I mean, I understand why he has these two particular politicians in here, but it's they're right now their legacy is on the left.
hmm
You know, with the nullification argument in
right,
particular, the left are huge advocates of putting forth or asserting their prerogatives against the federal government, especially on immigration, transgender type procedures, and anything sort of left wing. Um, they want to nullify federal law, even if federal law is appropriate to apply there. And that was one of the major arguments that the Southerners had with regard to the slavery issue. Now, he does mention, you know, that these two politicians, I mean, in fact, all political discourse of that era is just kind of perverted by
hmm
the slavery issue. It's just so, it's such a dominant issue, such an important issue. And also, it's impossible to pull apart the slavery issue from the philosophical arguments in favor or against,
right.
you know. But having said that, what he tried to distill from these two, you know, obviously very intelligent people, you know, what is it? What was their overall philosophy? You know, setting aside the particular slavery issue, you know, with regard to states' rights and federal government and liberty and freedom. And so I think that was
hmm
interesting. I think it makes a good point that they're of that mind, part of the conservative political thought history of the country,
hmm
but not generally followed.
right,
You know, if anything, repudiated by everybody and anybody eventually
right.
before their death. So, you know, it's I always bristle when people on the left try to well they try to paint the Republicans as the pro-slavery party, and of course they weren't. They were the exact opposite.
hmm
You know, Lincoln was famously a Republican. The Reconstructionists were, you know, Republicans.
hmm
All the initial class of African American or black legislators in Congress were Republicans. You know, the Democrat Party was a party of slavery and segregation and Jim Crow and all that.
hmm
So it always bothers me to, you know, there's this argument. Oh well, that's the tradition of the right,
right.
and I view that more as a reactionary strain on philosophical thought. But anyway, what are your thoughts
Yeah.
about
No, I agree. I
where these
appreciate.
guys fit in the history of conservative thought? And
Yeah, no, I appreciate what he tries to do here, sort of along the lines of what you were talking about, piecing apart, right, this idea of, because he does make, I think, a very compelling argument that there is a lot of overlap, especially with Randolph and sort of Burke's thought, about how they sort of discuss these issues of like, well, we shouldn't just force traditions to change, right? This is something that has to happen over time, right? Viewing sort of the North as just trying to force a culture to change, to force an entire civilization to change. And sort of, again, trying to piece that apart from the slavery issue is not an easy thing and an impossible thing. 'Cause I think, well, the tradition that they were trying to save was slavery, right? So that's not a defensible thing by any means, but sort of the intellectual arguments they put forward, more generally speaking, this abstract sort of concept of opposition to forced change and opposition to, right, this sort of federal government trying to force a change into their life. You can see how that is sort of a general conservative point of view. right? Another thing that they're trying to conserve isn't good. And he says that at the bottom of page 131. He says, human slavery is bad ground for conservatives to make a stand upon, yet it needs to be remembered that the wild demands and expectations of the abolitionists were quite as slippery a foundation for political decency. He says, yeah, this is not a good basis, right, to sort of stake your whole political ideology on, but it was a sort of ideology, and it did have these conservative streaks in it. So it is worth considering, especially in terms of, Southern politics, that this was a sort of cohesive tradition in some respects, or a cohesive school of thought in some ways, in regards to Randolph and Calhoun here.
Well, in some of the arguments, are arguments that are made now about the 10th Amendment and, the rights of individual states. And it's interesting, of course, one of the major issues that precipitated the Civil War and the divisive the dispute between the northern states and the southern states was tariffs,
Hmm.
because it was, the southern states were primarily agrarian, northern states being manufacturing, and so tariffs that would protect industry would hurt, the agricultural sales of cotton and other commodities to England and to other countries, because you end up having tariffs raised on those things, and so if you're protecting one, you're going to hurt the other necessarily, the industrial capacity, versus the agrarian. So it's kind of funny to see those tariff issues coming back up in the last year with Trump, um, and it kind of reverberating through society. It's not as defined state by state issue, but I really don't see really any discussion of them,
Hmm.
or any earnest discussions of tariffs on the left.
Yeah,
It's like they don't even know what to do about it.
right.
On the right, there's this huge battle between the free market people and the pro-Trump, where you say you want, fair trade rather than free trade. That so there's a big battle brewing on the right, but I don't, other than generally the Democratic Party, I guess, is saying that they're against
Hmm.
uh, tariffs.
Yeah, they kind of just dismiss them offhand, like this is an old-fashioned, useless
Yeah.
thing. Why are we even talking about this? It makes no sense to talk about it, I think is
Yeah.
generally most people on the left's opinion.
Yeah. But I really do think that a lot of the tactics, that they're all of the immigration, the local immigration laws, are really neo-Confederate. I mean, one writer in particular has been talking about the neo-Confederate philosophy for many years. Is Victor Davis Hanson.
Hmm.
He wrote a book. Gosh, it's been over 10 years, maybe 20 years. I think it was called Mexifornia. It's about immigration. And one of his big arguments is how we've basically decriminalized the any sort of violations of law that foreign citizens commit
Hmm.
in particular California, where he lives still, because like they'd put up a shack, they'd start a business, they'd dump on the side of the road, they being some, the immigrants, but none of them get cited because there's no way to collect on the fines.
Right.
It's a law, just a loss of effort and money. But if any American citizen, like a middle class person, did any of those things, you'd be hauled into court and sued and fined and cited and all that kind of thing. But these sanctuary laws, all the arguments that for the sanctuary laws are truly Confederate arguments. The exact same arguments that were made. And some of these are, like the nullification I talked about,
Hmm.
where
Yeah.
they're saying a state can nullify federal law, and
Right.
that's exactly what they're saying
Right.
now. It's amazing that they're saying whether the party, that they are the modern version of the northern anti-Confederate forces. They talk about slavery and racism, but they're using all of the exact same, I mean, same wording without
Mhm.
even attributing it. It's amazing.
Yeah, I went to a couple bookstores around town earlier this afternoon with a couple of my friends. I actually didn't buy anything. I didn't really find anything, which was surprising for me. I bought a couple books yesterday, though. But we ended up going. There's a real lefty bookstore in town. One of my friends hadn't been in there. Like, okay, we gotta show him the inside of this place because they have some ridiculous like stickers and books and stuff in there. And as we're walking in, they have signs by the door. It's like ice out. We reserve the right to refuse, an ICE officer, ICE agents to enter into our building and, abduct, people from our premises and things like. And it's that exact thing. They're saying, well, this is, my territory. This is, I don't, the laws of the federal government are void here on this private property. You have no authority to conduct actions here. And it's the exact same sort of nullification idea that they're talking about here. And it's the most radically left-wing bookstore I think I've ever been in.
Yeah.
I think even worse than some of the places we've been in and around St. Louis that are pretty bad. It's pretty egregious, and they're using these exact same arguments here, which I find very, very funny.
It's really unfortunate that almost every bookstore in the world,
Hmm.
and not, I'm exaggerating, but every bookstore, every independent bookstore in America is like left leaning.
Yeah,
At best, you get a truly independent store, which would just be like, we don't care about politics, we just want to
yeah,
sell books. But those are rare indeed, and
hmm,
those are usually chains,
yeah,
because otherwise it's just nonstop left wing lunacy.
right.
But yeah, I mean, and you see it on the local level, the local activists. I know some people that are anti-ICE, and it's um, and protesting. I know a couple people went to a No Kings rally, and it came up in conversation because I was joking that I almost went to one of them to hold up an anti-King Charles
Mm,
sign because
hmm. Pretty
we
good.
were there.
Yeah.
Like, oh, no, I really, really wish I would have gone.
Uh,
Um,
but yeah,
but
we should
anyway, yeah,
probably talk to
yeah,
talk about the book here.
yeah.
And I like
Well, you
his.
already did.
Yes,
We're
yes,
talking about the
dude.
book.
Yes, we are. I'm going to kind of get into his descriptions here. I like the way he describes John Randolph as this really just sort of enigma. He calls him like an Ishmael of politics, just sort of, going in and out of these towns and just kind of causing chaos everywhere he went, it seems. But interestingly, what he says on page 132, we're going to talk about here with Calhoun as well. He says they both began as lowercase d Democrats and after fashion radicals. When less than 30
Yeah,
years old, Representative John Randolph was the dominant spirit in the Congress of the United States, rejoicing with Jefferson at the collapse of the Federalist Party in the election of 1800, determined to break the conservative power of the federal judiciary. Very same story with John C. Calhoun a little bit later. And he says they became conservatives because they perceived that the strong drift of the world was not toward the tranquil, agricultural, decentralized life they loved, but towards a consolidated and industrialized new order. So, we were talking a couple episodes ago about sort of the conservatism of the Federalist Project. This is sort of a reaction from other sort of conservative leaning people eventually that will know, hey, I just want to be on my own land. I want to keep my traditions. This sort of federalizing that happens after the fall of the Federalist Party is not the same thing that I signed up for. And to those people
yeah.
were Randolph and Calhoun.
Well, and it doesn't go into detail, but the judiciary under Adams was pretty out of control. I mean,
Mhm.
with the Alien Sedition Act, they were the Supreme Court was acting as trial court for enforcement. The trial, I think there's a chief judge that was acting as a trial judge to enforce that statute. It was crazy. And so there were a lot of constitutional violations there that helped propel Thomas Jefferson into the presidency, and of course, he was of this traditionalist agrarian, boosting philosophy, with a states' rights argument and not consolidating power in the federal government. But then, of course, when he got in, it's like everybody's against consolidating power until they are in power,
Mhm.
and then they necessarily consolidate power. I mean, the Louisiana Purchase was probably unconstitutional. I mean, when you really look at it, I mean, what gave him the authority to expand the United States?
Mhm.
Because I believe he did it without congressional approval,
Yeah, I
and
know
I don't even
he
think
was
he didn't even
working
have
on the.
funding. I
Yeah,
don't even think he officially had funding, and maybe after the fact. I'll have to look it up. I mean, I don't know if my memory serves me correctly, but certainly he was asserting a power that even he and I think it was in a private papers, he admitted, I may not be able to do this, but this is just an opportunity I can't pass up.
right.
And so, his followers, some of them, like these gentlemen, were aghast at that kind of expansion of federal power from somebody that they thought would never do that and they never agreed with. And so then they alienated everybody. They've already, hated, one half of the politically active country. And then now they're making enemies of, Thomas Jefferson, his followers. I mean, who's left?
Right. Yeah, because I know he was
Yep.
working. I just was reading this the other day. He was working on a constitutional amendment, essentially, that would be voted on, proposed in Congress and things like that. But then he realized, like, well, by the time it takes to draft this whole thing, get it approved for me to have this authority, Napoleon's going to change his mind. And so he just
Yep.
bought it with,
Just
money that he got from somewhere, essentially, just from on behalf of the United States, and just
right.
paid for it himself, which is pretty amazing. But then Kirk goes on to talk about what are sort of these principles of Southern conservatism here on page 133. He identifies four things that are sort of key here. He says a preference for the slow process of natural change, distinguished from artificial innovation. Secondly, a deep affection for agricultural life and a contempt for trade and manufactures. Third, an assertive individualism, social and political. And then fourth, this is probably the most controversial one, he says an uneasy awareness, sometimes bursting into defiance, sometimes rocked into somnolence, of the immense problem which must exist whenever two races occupy the same territory. He says that's sort of the shadow behind all of these, Southern political discussions of what do we do about slavery, right? These are essentially two different societies that we have here, right? With these two different groups of people. What happens if slavery ends, right? How does our society change, right? We can really never let that happen, in the minds of the Southerners here, the white Southerners, because then that would just change everything. And we now have this immense problem to figure out what to do with all of these people who are just not really part of society as it stands.
Yeah. And in any fair discussion of these gentlemen, you have to bring that in. You can't
Right.
just you can't just talk about the philosophical underpinnings to their objections. If you're going to talk about Southern conservatives in this era, you got to talk about how they supported slavery and why. And I think the only thing that I think has some merit to the argument they're making, it isn't race based, but it's like I think there's some argument about a cultural,
Hmm.
the whole melting pot argument, and I think now, modern day, we gloss over the practical difficulties involving slavery, and just abolishing it immediately would have significant practical issues. But if you just did it with a wand, and I mean, and Lincoln delayed and delayed and delayed,
Hmm.
and then because the vote even among whites was limited. There's a
Hmm.
discussion in this book about how Virginia had you had to be a freeholder. I forget how much you had to own, but you had to have a certain amount of land that you owned. I think free of debt, maybe even. But there's a certain threshold before you could even vote or hold office. So that it was a lot more complicated then than what it is now, just practically speaking. But anyway, back to my original point was I think we've done a disservice to our country where we've gotten kind of hung up on the race thing when we really should be talking about the cultural attitudes of individuals, and whether or not you really share the values of somebody who wants to live in a constitutional republic.
Hmm.
And we ought to really do a better job of before we allow people in this country to live here on a permanent or semi-permanent basis, to make sure that they agree with certain general principles of a citizen, even though you're not necessarily granting them citizenship immediately. What do they agree with, the principles of citizenship in the United States? That whole idea of a melting pot, which has now been kind of discredited, and part of it is to expand on that is how effectively the left has discredited the anti-communist efforts in the 1940s and 50s, and they did get a little carried away, but not as carried away as the left claims they did, because the Communist Party. And there's a question of whether or not you should even allow it, because it is by its philosophy is anti-American and anti-constitutional, and it almost necessarily calls for the overthrow of the elected republic. Yeah.
Right.
So how is it legal to have an organization like that? Now I understand you can advocate for certain things, and that's not illegal. We have a First Amendment, but once you start organizing to bring it about, it really is un-American.
Hmm.
And so that so anyway, so that's kind of a more of a broader thing. And I think so. I think there's some controversial element in there that I guess could be explored, but it's just all, like I said, perverted by that horrible issue, and a lot of it's just self-service. It's like
Right.
they had slaves, they didn't want to give them up, and so well, they found a way to argue in favor of it without addressing the underlying immorality of it
Hmm.
and the complete and total lack of justification of enslaving somebody. I mean,
Right.
it's so obviously abhorrent, and that's how smart they were. That they were making some sort of intellectual argument to keep it, and it's astounding that they were able to do that with a straight face, but
Right.
they did.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, kind of getting into this discussion of Randolph a little bit more here. But he was a highly like intelligent and well-read
Oh
man,
yeah,
it seems, right? He talks about that on page 136, which Calhoun later gives a description of him. He says, "Highly talented, eloquent, severe, and eccentric, not unfrequently wandering from the question, but often uttering wisdom worthy of a Bacon and wit that would not discredit a Sheridan. Every speaker has freely indulged him in his peculiar manner, and that without responsibility or censure." Right? And so he's got this great sort of, intellect, it seems. I mean, interesting, I thought this was very interesting. Bottom of page 136, by the time that Kirk is writing this in the early 50s, he says, Randolph's speeches and letters never having been collected, one must
yeah.
grope through the dusty volumes of the Annals of Congress, etc., newspaper clippings and things like that. I thought that was fascinating, right? That you have this wildly influential politician, and nobody had bothered to collect all of his speeches and letters, right? Because I think he's just became such an unspeakable, figure. And again, I don't know if this has changed in the past, 70 years since this book was published. Maybe somebody's done the work of putting all of his sort of writings together. But I thought it was amazing that this hadn't been collected together for as influential as he was, right? For later researchers to use and analyze and things like that.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. So I assume that it's been done, but I meant to look it up and I didn't. But it's fascinating when he actually gets into his philosophy. It's not slavery related. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas here. He talks about that Randolph had a belief that democratic passion for legislating is a menace to liberty,
Hmm.
which is said on 137. And that's so true. Like I forget who coined the phrase, or the objection any day, like basically any day that the legislature's not in session is a good day for America. I don't know if that's a quote or if it's just a sentiment that a lot of people share, but it's there's always this push, and I even at a local conservative Republican level, like I went to there's a legislative breakfast for state legislators from Jefferson County every year. So I went this year. I hadn't gone in a couple of years, and so I went, and every one of them touted how many bills they filed and how many they get passed, and except for one guy who didn't care about that, but he was more of a gadfly personality type, entertaining speaker. But it always struck me as odd, like why, I mean, I understand, like I think with all the laws that we have on the books, I think the best thing to do is focus on amending the current laws or maybe repealing some of them, or like uh, fine tuning them.
Right.
That makes sense. But when you're saying, well, we need to have this new law, we need to have this new right, we have to spend on this new thing, and I'm in not a right wing county, but certainly right of center, and all of them are Republicans.
Hmm.
Now, granted, it was a nonpartisan breakfast type thing, so they shouldn't have been, there wasn't a red meat type event for, right wing conservatives, but still, it's just kind of off putting
Yeah.
to somebody that is truly conservative when all the legislators are like, well, we're going to have to bring more government
Hmm.
into your daily life.
Right. And that's what he says
And of course,
on.
Randolph was opposed to
Yeah.
that because he says that's really the danger.
Hmm.
Creating all these laws and expanding everything is the real danger. And I thought it was interesting. I think it was him, and then to Calhoun, basically saying that the Constitution isn't really the protection that
Yeah.
everybody thinks it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's what he says here in 138, right? He has this good quote a little bit higher on the page. He says the United States in particular are cursed with this modern urge to alter, mutilate, and paralyze by legislative fiat, and the cause of this American delusion is a wild and impractical interpretation of the doctrines of natural equality. A little bit lower in that paragraph, he says good political constitutions alone do not suffice to resist this legislative maggot. First, the delusion that the state is competent to regulate all things must be exploded, and then power must be counterpoised against power, since mere parchment is no insurance against oppression. Right? So he says, well, the Constitution doesn't guarantee that this is never going to happen, right? And sort of guided by these sort of abstract doctrines, that you see sort of enshrined, in the Declaration of Independence and things like that, you have this tendency for legislators, kind of what we were talking about earlier, once they get in power, to be like, well, I see all these problems. Let's just write up a solution to all these problems, right? And just legislative, act after act, tries to address these things. There's no real protection against that, except as Randolph believed, power, right? You have to assert, right, sort of the power of the state to go against, what the federal government says, right? That's the only way to stop this sort of avalanche of bills and lawmaking, because otherwise it's just going to keep going endlessly, right? And I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, and he has a real disdain for like a complete democracy.
Hmm.
Which he thinks is which is hand in hand with the legislature, expanding the vote and expanding the laws. And I don't know what to think about this section. 139 says, "Men are not born free and equal," said Randolph. "Their physical, moral, and intellectual differences are manifest, to say nothing of their differences of birth and wealth." And I think that's true,
Hmm.
right? But I have yet to have anybody advocate or design a system that 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 somehow addresses that
Hmm.
in a way that is appropriate.
Yeah.
You know, you either just say we got to treat everybody the same, no matter what their intellect is. I mean, to a certain degree, obviously, if you're incapacitated, you're going to be out. But assuming that you meet the minimum level of intellectual capacity to vote and participate, I don't know how you address this
Yeah.
appropriately, where you're not sticking it to people inappropriately.
Hmm.
We have an aristocracy. Well, who decides who the aristocrats are?
Right.
And invariably, you're gonna discriminate, meaning bad discrimination, against large segments of the population, and then to retain power and to keep people down,
Hmm.
subjugated. I mean, I don't,
Yeah.
I recognize what they're saying,
Hmm.
but what's the solution? And he talks about, freeholders. You have a certain, qualification to be vote. And I get that. I mean, I'm not in favor of that. I certainly wouldn't have been in favor of it in my 20s when I didn't have anything.
Hmm.
Why
Right.
wouldn't I be able to vote?
Hmm.
And who's to say that, you know, elderly person, who has accrued, all this wealth during their life, should have more of a say
Right.
in the world, especially if they're super elderly and they have no meaningful future. What I'm saying? I mean, not no future, but a limited future just by life expectancy.
Hmm.
So I don't, do you know what I'm saying? I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know how do you design a system that even recognizes that or even considers it.
Right. I think the only like possible solution would be something like we were talking about last week. I think is canning, right? Sort of the idea of a society set up not by complete individuality, but by like what sort of your profession is, right? Sort of more of a guild system in some sort of way, where it's like, well, within this specific sphere, right? You belong, to the metal workers or whatever. You among the metal workers, you decide your own structure of like how you are going to cast a vote on behalf of your interests. And I think in systems like that, where you have like smaller
Yeah.
units deciding amongst themselves, because then like, well, I know who is better at this profession. I know who really has the interests in mind and who's capable of sort of deciding things, right? Sort of in, I guess, sort of more the town hall discussion type environments within a particular group of people, you could all sort of filter out what is sort of the best approach for you as a unit. That's the other thing I can think of where you would have sort of things
Yeah.
sift through and work out in such a way that it would, sort of address the thing that he's talking about here. But again, that's an impossible system to set up, once you have a system with universal suffrage. You know, if you propose that, it's like, what, you want me to give up my position? All of a sudden, I have to vote as a unit with all the other graduate assistants at, you know, the University of Florida. Well, I don't, they don't represent me. Right? I don't care about what those people have to say. But I feel like that's the only type of system that would sort of address those things without just being like, well, you're not smart enough to vote. You don't vote. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, well, I don't, I think that's completely impractical anyway, because
Yep.
it would just exacerbate sectionalism.
Hmm.
You know, it wouldn't, it's not a solution that would work. So I just, and I think even in this chapter, I'm trying to remember where I saw it in, but even they recognize that, you know, like the intellectuals aren't necessarily the people that have the wisdom, you know, like, you know, sometimes an illiterate, quite frankly, if I was gonna pick between somebody with a PhD from Harvard, I'd be ruled by that person or ruled by an illiterate farmer, like in rural Missouri. I'm taking the farmer. I mean, literally an illiterate. You know, I mean, and so but even what you're saying, nobody's really proposing that, and if you
Yeah.
proposed it, it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
So it's like I just don't understand what the fixation is on it, other than, you know, it's almost like a disdain of humanity.
Hmm.
You know, it's like, well, I'm just going to judge everybody, and I'm smarter than everybody, so I want the vote, and my cronies, you know, get the vote. We could, you know, because we know better than you.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, really, do you? And because everybody has a knowledge of their own individual circumstance and their family and their friends and where they work, and sometimes when they make decisions or they vote or whatever, they're wrong, and sometimes I'm wrong. You know, I mean, so it just seems like I understand the risk of expanding the vote to everybody, because then every knucklehead who has no idea, you know, what's going on in the world votes. Like that's why I'm an advocate for low voter turnout.
Yeah.
You know, like you expand the ability to vote, but you know, we should almost we should have public service campaigns. You know, like these public ads by the Ad Council, which we fund, which
Hmm.
is, you know, to say, hey, don't drive drunk. Okay, well, I didn't know that. You know, all these, you know, it's really just payola for the radio stations and the TV stations. But in any event, but you know, we almost should have a public a PR campaign from the government trying to dissuade people from voting.
Yeah.
You know, where you say, you know, if you don't know what the three branches of the government are, don't vote. You know,
Hmm.
like it's just to say like 10 things. If you're not aware of this, don't vote.
Hmm.
Defer to the other people who have voted, and if you don't know those things, learn it and then vote. That's really what we should be doing. It should be a public education campaign. And I think that might be the solution, you know, and then based upon whatever is going on in your world and your knowledge and your expertise, as long as you have a certain base knowledge, I think that might be the solution. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm fearful of any restriction of an individual's right to vote if you're a
Hmm.
citizen. You know, I just I don't see how you administer it, and I don't see what the net benefit is. Net benefit, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Sort of aside from those issues, then he sort of talks about, you know, particularism and localism here on page 142. He's got this quote from 1816. He says, I, for one, cling to them, said Randolph, of the several states, in his reply to Calhoun, because in clinging to them, I cling to my country, because I love my country as I do my immediate connections. For the love of country is
Hmm.
nothing more than the love of every man for his wife, child, or friend. I am not for a policy which must end in the destruction, and speedy destruction, too, of the whole of state governments, right? Sort of this discussion of state rights, but even more so like local rights, right? I love my country because I love my family. I love those immediately around me. And insofar as they make up, you know, what the country is, right? Of it's is immediate connections, you know, my, you know, immediate connections have other immediate connections. They have other immediate connections, right? And focusing on sort of the particular and the local rather than the sort of this abstract, you know, ideal overarching thing, right? That's really his focus. He says that's really where my patriotism comes from. That's where my love for things comes from, is because I love my neighbor in some way. You know, I feel connection with my neighbor. And then of course, you know, he owned slaves, so it's like, well, you know, how much did you really love your immediate connections and things like that? But it's that's sort of the principle that he's trying to articulate here.
Yeah, and I think that ties into, there's a quote on the previous page. I don't need to go back, but the author mentions that the belief there his belief, not the author's belief, but Randolph's belief, that abstract sentimentality ends in real brutality.
Mm.
And so that's what he's talking about, like a particularity, particularism, like the real solutions to the real problems of the real individuals. And I think this abstract sentimentality is really what the big problem we have in our country now. It's like we think, oh, we want everybody to be welcome in our country. Okay, that's an abstract mentality, and but it's not practical when because you have to say, okay, well, what about this person? Okay, okay, we'll accept that general. I accept that general feeling as true. We should welcome people into our country. Okay, what about this particular person? And it's a dude with tattoos all over his face.
Hmm.
Well, maybe if he's a circus performer, because that's somebody who may have tattoos on his face, and maybe we want more circus performers, and maybe he's super talented, or he's like Post Malone, who not Post Malone is, I think he's an American,
Hmm.
but let's say there's somebody who's an artist, okay, well that particular person maybe, but maybe not the guy that has like a tattoo for every person he's murdered and his whole face is covered, that particular thing, no, because in particular, no, but abstract, okay. And I think it's become really, really dangerous, especially on the left of today, that oh, they have this idea
Hmm.
of being helpful and being kind, and then without any sort of limitation on a practical implementation of it.
Right. And I think just to conclude talking about Randolph here, I like this quote on the
That's it.
well, moving
I
right
want,
along.
I want like a 5 minute rant, and you just
Well,
I want a 5 minute rant, and you just yes, okay.
no, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. But I like this quote here at the bottom of page 144, right? This excerpt from this speech in 1830, talking about revising the Constitution of Virginia. He says, "It has been better said than I am capable of saying it, that the lust of innovation, for it is a lust, that is the proper term for an unlawful desire, this lust of innovation, this rerum novarum libido, has been the death of all republics. Recollect that change is not always amendment. Remember that you have to reconcile to new institutions the whole mass of those who are contented with what they have and seek no change, and besides these, all the disappointed of the other class." And I think that's just a very good encapsulation of his sort of better thought here, even excluding it from the question of slavery here. This idea that not all change is amendment, right? That it is not a positive change. We can just change things for no reason. We have to consider what are the lasting impacts. How does this affect this class of people who are being changed and the other class who's disappointed with the change, right? How do you reconcile those things? And too often we're just making these changes, like you said, for these just abstract ideals rather than considering what is this change actually for. That was his sort of main point in this convention in 1830.
Yes, and I think you might have accidentally said the wrong word. Like he said, change is not reform.
Yes.
It's not necessarily an improvement. You said change is not an amendment or something like that. So that's really his key was just because not all change is good is
Mhm.
really what he's saying. And I thought it was funny that he was opposing the insertion of any amendment clause into the new Constitution. Like once you adopt it, you don't want you to be able to amend it,
Mhm.
which I thought was a rather extreme view. I remember when we were working on the county charter for Jefferson County. I was behind the scenes on that. I had a partner that was on the commission, and they wanted to have a limitation on. I think it was a limitation on eminent domain. So the proposal was to have it had to be unanimous. All the council members had to unanimously agree. And I wasn't part of the debate because I was behind the scenes, but I was like, you can't do that because what if you have one knucklehead in there that won't agree to anything? You can't do that. And so like I think what if it turns out one of your provisions in a constitution is harmful? Well, you got to be able to amend it. How do you draft a constitution? And so his views of against any sort of change or updating or were rather extreme, I would
Hmm.
think. If
Yes.
you're not even willing to prove a provision which had a supermajority to if you amend the Constitution in the future. Yeah,
Yes. No, I agree.
kind
But
of
that takes us,
explains his philosophy against things very well.
yeah,
Yes.
no. But that takes us on to John C. Calhoun here, which he essentially agreed with Randolph, it seems, on just about everything, but a little bit of a different figure. Now, as he says on page 146, that Randolph was just very well read, right? He had the richest library in Virginia. Calhoun was not a man of books. He's a man of few books, relying on independent meditation, sort of coming to these
Mhm.
things, just sort of reflecting on these things that he learned from Randolph and just sort of his own sort of desires and interests in this capacity. But this is what he says. This is a quote from the top of page 147. He says, "If there be a political proposition universally true, one which springs directly from the nature of man and is independent of circumstances, it is that irresponsible power is inconsistent with liberty and must corrupt those who exercise it. On this great principle, our political system rests." Right. So he really loved the Constitution. He was different from Randolph in that way, that he was more of a man of the Constitution, of these sort of documents than Randolph was. Right. He loved it. He loved the Constitution. He loved the federal government insofar as it protected against this power. So that's why he kind of fell away from
Mhm.
federalism, is he saw that there was more of a positive argument here, but very similar sort of values, I would say, to Randolph here. That right, these checks on power, checking the power of the federal government, and the Constitution actually does a pretty good job of that. Was Calhoun's perspective.
Yes. And that's that, where he's trying to limit the federal government's power. That's where he comes up with the theory of nullification,
Right.
which is the idea that every state could decide, well, we're just going to follow federal law. We're a separate sovereign, and so we're going to nullify it. It's kind of like jury nullification. It's not really authorized, but it could create a tremendous constitutional crisis, and it did then, and it does now. And so that's when you see, like in the 1950s, federal troops desegregating schools in Arkansas, because there's a federal court ruling being enforced. And same thing you see now with federal agents, and they're kind of dancing around each other.
Hmm.
Like in Minnesota, like the federal agents they're not cooperating with the local authorities or vice versa. And so the question is, okay, are we really going to get into a constitutional? They're like in parallel universes. Like the state is saying, well, we don't support the federal immigration enforcement, so we're going to oppose you, but we're not necessarily going to obstruct you, which is a difficult thing to pull off. Um, and so, this was, of course, over slavery, and like I think it was initially one of them was the Slave Act, where they had a big fight over all these practical things, like what if a slave escaped and went to a free state? Could they go and get him
Hmm.
or her? And then what if they traveled voluntarily? Like what if they traveled with their slaves to a free state? Does that make them free, or is the free state going to have to enforce the rules of slavery of this person's property? The interstate is essentially an interstate commerce issue,
Hmm.
and so there's all these practical issues. That's why I said slavery just perverted the entire political structure, and debates, and the court decisions where everybody knew it was such a volatile issue because it was so fundamental to the economy in the South, and it had to have violence to back it up because it was such an abhorrent practice. Nobody wanted to be the one responsible for lighting that tinderbox on fire and having the whole thing blow up.
Right.
But there's a bit little discussion of nullification, which he doesn't really go into very much because it really discredits the Calhoun,
Right, and it's
I
really
think.
ironic that so much of his discussion here with Calhoun is about minority rights, which now we think of
Yes.
in a very different way. Right, when you say minority rights, your mind immediately goes to all these sort of modern initiatives for disadvantaged minority populations and things like that. But that was his exact principle. He
Yeah.
says, the bottom of page 149, he says, "For," said Calhoun, "governments at heart are designed chiefly to protect minorities, numerical minorities, or economic or sectional or religious or political. Preponderant majorities need no protection, and in a rude way can exist without proper government. They have naked force to maintain themselves. He says, and that's the purpose of the constitutional
Mhm.
government, is to provide essentially security for these minority groups, whatever they may be, so that the will of the majority does not just overtake them and do whatever they want, enforce whatever laws they want upon this minority of the population. And of course, the minority he's thinking about is just the southern states and, defending slavery and things like that. So, misguided sort of practical application here, but sort of in principle, right? It makes sense, right? His sort of arguments on these constitutional grounds.
Well, he's also, it wasn't just limited to that argument either. It was, the agrarian society, which is less populous.
Hmm.
The agrarian owners, and if you're just going to go by a simple vote of economic policy for the United States, you can impoverish, the farmers, while you're benefiting the manufacturers. So there's a lot more issues. The slavery dominated in this era, obviously, because it was so important. But there are other economic and issues and other subsets where he's talking about minority rights, which were, also important.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think
Um,
it's interesting his discussion here on page 151, talking about what exactly he's proposing here, and his description of government. He says, "What I propose, right, not just discussing, effective checks upon arbitrary power. He says, what I propose is far more limited to explain on what principles government must be formed in order to resist by its own interior structure, or to use a single term, organism, the tendency to abuse of power. This structure or organism is what is meant by constitution in its strict and more usual sense." So kind of similar to what we are talking about Randolph, right? Sort of the localism, particularism, right? The love of country is built on love of neighbor in some way, right? He views the state, right, the proper constitution of the state, as an organism, as sort of this natural thing in some way, right? And that is how we have to focus our discussions of government and discussing these sort of natural connections between people that form society, and how exactly we use those natural connections to restrict the abuse of power, right? To protect the rights of minorities in particular communities. I thought that was an interesting discussion talking about government as an organism, right? Rather than, because of course he's very opposed to this abstract sort of philosophizing and abstract ideals. But to him, like government is a very real thing. It's almost in some way like a physical, like biological thing, right? With this term that he's using of organism. So that's a
yeah,
really interesting sort of perspective that he's talking about here.
yeah. It was a lot of people recent years calls it the blob.
Yeah.
Like the Washington D.C. blob. And there was a movie called The Blob. It was like a horror movie. It was kind of an absurd premise. It was like this slowly expanding blob.
Hmm.
And you wonder, how did people get caught up by the blob? It didn't move fast. It would just, then all of a sudden people would be like, oh, they've been taken by the blob. Um, so it didn't seem as threatening, but it was kind of spooky. I think it was black and white
Yeah.
50s movie.
There you go.
Uh, anyway, that's what the government kind of is, though. It's like this ever expanding thing that will just like envelop everything and everybody unless you fight back against it. And I don't know if I'm bouncing too far in front, but I think one of the parallel um, principles to his objection to that and description of that organism of government that'll take people's freedom. He mentions on 155, liberty and complete equality, far from being inseparable, are incompatible.
Mhm.
If by pure equality is meant equality of conditions, for progress, moral and material is derived from inequality of condition, and without progress, liberty decays, which I thought was a really interesting way to look at it. Like if you it's kind of like a equality of outcome. Like no, if that's what you're trying to get, then you have to have an increasing amount of force to get everybody equalized. Um, if that's what you mean by equality, it's incompatible with liberty. You can't have equality and liberty
Mhm.
if you're looking for equality of outcome, because you have to have governmental force to force everything to be as close to the same condition as possible. And I think um, that argument may have been well ahead of its time, I
Yeah.
think.
And I think it's related to what he says just a couple pages beforehand. Sorry, Joe, go back to page 153, where he's talking about essentially the problem that Randolph proposed of like, well, how do we deal with all these people who right really can't have the same vote and things like that? And he says in general, Calhoun has the view that votes should be weighed as well as counted, but Calhoun
Yeah.
proposes to weigh not merely the individual votes of particular persons, but the several wills of large groups in the nation. He proposes to take into account the differing economic elements, the geographical sections, perhaps yet other distinct interests, and they are to be protected from the encroachments of one another by a mutual negative, or rather a commonly available negative, right? So it's like a whole block of people can sort of just counteract the block of other people. Essentially, if their views are just completely incompatible with the other person's, they can essentially just a mass group veto in some way. And he says, well, that's really how we should structure societies, not just on this principle of abstract equality, and everybody gets to decide for themselves, but it's like these large groups of people in some way. I don't know. He doesn't go into the specifics of how exactly it works, but they decide amongst themselves what's best for them as a unit, and they can counteract, this other unit, and as they decide amongst themselves, and that's really how you secure liberty, not for by pursuing this abstract equality in some way.
Yeah, I think he just described the electoral college.
Yeah, it
You
seems
know,
it seems like it.
and I think these guys would be aghast at direct election of senators.
Hmm.
And the more I think about it over the years, the more convinced I am that that was a huge mistake. Because it is so important to have the U.S. senators be representatives of their various states. And I think our U.S. senators, not ours in particular, ours aren't terrible. Schmidt and Hawley, they tend to be focused on Missouri prerogatives generally. But they're once they go to Washington for a while, they become acolytes of the federal government, and really defenders of their own prerogatives
Hmm.
as federal agents, as opposed to representative of the various states. And I think that when it was originally set up, it was brilliant in that sense. Those senators represent the state, and then the people that are congressmen, the representatives, are elected, in their various districts as a more direct election. But direct election from the people, but then the senators are selected by the state legislature or the state, however the state decides. But to have them also voted for by the people, and they're so large now and populous that we lose control over these senators. And I think that's what he's really describing is that the people in Missouri can get together and we can our two senators can counteract the whatever nonsense they're doing in Illinois because
Hmm.
we have two votes, they have two votes in the Senate, or New York can counteract us, and then if there's a regional faction, we can kind of get together and maybe block things from another regional factor. And so I think that's really what the system is set up. I don't know. I still don't know after reading all this. Well, how do you do that? How do you weight them? How do you select them, and how do you make that any more appropriate than the current system? Which I don't think you can. I think it'll just be worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, and it would either be counterproductive or it'd lead to war.
Hmm.
I mean, literally,
Yeah.
it would lead to violence.
Yeah, it would have to lead to some weird utilitarian political calculation of measuring what is the maximal possible good of your vote versus somebody else's vote, right? Measuring income and education just turn into a nightmare, I
Yeah.
think. But he does present, just to sort of conclude this section on Calhoun, this really
Yeah.
interesting quote, pages 156 and 57, that I think he is pretty much spot on about and really prescient. But he says, what is called public opinion, instead of being the united opinion of the whole community, is usually nothing more than the opinion or voice of the strongest interest or combination of interests, and not infrequently of a small but energetic and active portion of the whole. Public opinion in relation to government and its policy is as much divided and diversified as are the interests of the community. And the press, instead of being the organ of the whole, is usually but the organ of these various and diversified interests respectively, or rather of the parties growing out of them. It is used by them as the means of controlling public opinion and of so molding it as to promote their peculiar interests and to aid in carrying on the warfare of a party. And I think that is just all the more true today over the past, 20 years, especially in the mainstream media, right, where it isn't speaking for the whole country, definitely not describing public opinion, but was, and still is in many respects, just an arm of the Democrat Party, and especially the farthest left parts of the Democrat Party is what was funding, a lot of the mainstream media and the opinions being voiced in it.
Yeah, and back in this era, Calhoun's era, they were partisan press. They were known. They would say we're the Republican or the Federalist paper or the Democrat paper or the Whig paper. And in modern era, I think one of the best developments we've had in the last 20 years is the realization of the general public, to a large extent, that the press is partisan. And just having that. Now, I mean, I'm not saying that it's good that they are. It's just that I think people have found out that's why the ratings are so low. And they're not reliable.
Right.
But wouldn't be as bad if they were honest about it. And they're getting around to it. I think it's just being blatantly. I think Trump really helped out with that because they were just blatant in admitting, well, they're not going to be, quote unquote objective journalists anymore
Hmm.
because that's not appropriate with such a dangerous person. Okay, all right. Well, now we know. Now you've admitted it. And it seems like almost every one of those people that have said that publicly are now out of the business.
Hmm.
Like Terry Moran, I think might have been one of them. I'd have to look that up to verify, but I think he was one of those ones that are like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be objective. Um, anyway,
Yeah.
but you're right that same description of the media then is in existence now, and it really is. It's hard to figure out a fix to that one too,
Hmm.
because and it's not necessarily just the press. It's like, okay, who's really interested? Like, yeah, there's some local controversies between a couple factions in the Republican Party in our county, and I don't know all the people involved. I know of them, or I know them. I know some of them, and no one will ever hear my thoughts on either faction or
Hmm.
their dispute because I don't care enough of about their petty issues. They have dueling candidates for a couple of local offices, and it's very important to them.
Hmm.
But because they're motivated, they're all over social media and they're out there and they're campaigning, and I just can't care. I
Hmm.
mean, I could. I guess it's physically I'm able to, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to care enough, and so then my voice isn't going to be heard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's just a natural thing is that those loudest, most motivated voices are heard, and that's an issue in a
Hmm.
democracy because there are a lot more people like me, a lot more than there are the activists,
Yeah.
and so we just let them move the conversation one direction or the other.
Yeah, and I think it is such a problem that so many of the activists are so good at presenting some really crazy things as really normal things, right? If you
Yeah.
look at a lot of the rhetoric on the left, right, a lot of it's just sort of that kindness talk. Were we talking about this last week? I think we might have talked about this last week, right?
Mhm.
Where it's just like, well, this is just the kind and decent thing to do, and if you oppose this, you're just not a very decent person, right? And that's what a lot of the rhetoric, framed around. So a lot of these people who just really don't care either way initially, right? If you just listen to enough ads on TV, almost see enough posters around of sort of these left-wing initiatives, and so much of them are framed around, well, this is just the loving thing to do. This is just the kind thing to do. That really works on a lot of people, and that just becomes their baseline. Because it's, well, I don't want to be a rude person. I don't want to be an indecent person, without really considering, well, what is the thing that's being advocated for or against here, right? Is this in any way a good thing to be doing, right? But it just sort of becomes ingrained that, oh, this is just the kind thing to do. And if I oppose this, I'm just being rude and mean. It's like that's a very different sort of style of rhetoric. And, you're not even really trying to convince anybody that you're right. You're just trying to convince them that they'd be weird and mean if they opposed you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the most diabolical political sayings of my lifetime is "love is love,"
Hmm.
because it equates all types of affection
Hmm.
as equal, and and that is it is so obviously false. that and it's just it's so destructive of any values based um, evaluation of a lot of different things. But people will be like, well, yeah, love is love. And then it's like, oh, well, if you're not in favor of this, then you hate, right?
Yeah.
Because what is the opposite of love? It's hate.
Hmm.
And then it's like, well, or I could just say that that doesn't equal that.
Right.
That's not love. That
Hmm.
is something else. And it's anyway. So I mean, without even going into any detailed factual descriptions of the various things that love are not love, you could think of various examples, but it was very effective.
Hmm.
And there are still people that will say love is love, and the people that say love is love are the most hateful people in the world. And so if anybody in the unlikely event that there's anybody still listening to this episode that has ever uttered or posted on social media or in any way publicly stated love is love, you're probably a bad person,
Hmm.
and most likely hateful and angry. So reevaluate your priorities.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
But that type of manipulation of language and of people's values, it can be so effective and it's so frustrating.
Yeah.
And then, of course, then the criticism is, well, then why are you still on the sidelines? And I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to be the guy who stands up and then everybody says, "Oh, well, you're anti-love. You hate love." And it's like, you don't want to be that guy. Well, no, of course I don't do that. But it's been so effectively framed.
I guess
That's why.
I think that overstates my position. I just become apathetic, which
Yeah.
is maybe worse. I'm
Mm.
not fearful.
Yeah. But I'm not talking
Um,
about you specifically. I think a lot of other
yes,
people are, especially like in college classroom settings, right? You can't be the one
I
guy in class and, things like that. I don't want to be the one standing
well,
up against this.
I, I do think that the most of it is just I don't want to bother with it.
Yeah.
It's like it's not a fear. It's just like you do a brief calculation. You know whether okay, do I want to be the person that tells this nut job that they're a nut job? You never want to argue with an insane person. You never convince them they're wrong. They're insane.
Hmm.
And so all of us across the country for the last 50 years have been making that decision.
Yeah.
Just leaving.
Yeah.
I'll just sit here.
Hmm.
I'll just watch the show. Um, and then the only bad thing about that is if somebody does stand up, almost always the crowd won't do anything to help.
Hmm.
That one person that's willing to be difficult. And I think that's where we run into problems. But I don't know what the solution of it is. But I don't. Getting back to the book,
Hmm.
I don't know that their solutions, their proposed solutions, or advocacy for the minority rights in particular are really very practical. I just didn't. I didn't find anything inspirational from these two thinkers.
Yeah.
Any solutions? I agree with some of the general principles about the tyranny of the majority I'm sympathetic to the argument about of maybe figuring out a way to limit the vote a little bit. But like I said, I think it shouldn't be by law.
Yeah.
I think people should just decide not to do it if they don't know what the heck's going on.
Yeah.
But I think everybody should know. How are you going to decide whether they're right or not?
Hmm.
And I'll give you an example. An example where I was wrong. I thought the people of Pennsylvania were crazy to elect Fetterman
Mm.
instead of Oz, the Dr. Oz. But I think they got it right.
Hmm.
I mean, they knew these candidates better than I did. Now, granted, he had a stroke in the meantime. Maybe fix what was wrong with him. I don't know. I'm trying to think of there's been a couple of those candidates. I was like, God, I don't know why they're voting this way or that. And then it comes out, and I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, I guess, and I would have said, well, you're just crazy stupid for deciding that. And it turns out, I'm not advocating for this. It turns out that we were probably better off that Trump didn't get reelected. That he had a 4-year interim, although lots of craziness happened in the 4 years. But I think he's a lot more effective now than he would have been, the 4 years back to back.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so maybe
Yeah.
the voters were right if they were counted right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, going back to your point about not finding, much to get out of these things, I agree, and it seems like, just to draw it into his conclusion of this chapter, that it seems like that's kind of what happened in the South as well, that they put together
Yeah.
sort of this somewhat coherent philosophy between the two of them of this sort of Southern conservatism, but it didn't really stick, right? There's no people really after Randolph and Calhoun really explicitly arguing for these things. A lot of it just has to do with the political and then military defeat of the South, after the Civil War. He says it really turned from this sort of Southern philosophy into more of just like sort of a Southern like instinct, right? You don't have thinkers of this caliber sort of emerging in Southern politics for quite some time after. So it seems like that was sort of just the brief, moment with these two guys sort of advocating for some sort of political philosophy here that was ultimately sort of swept away in the ensuing decades.
Yes.
Yes. Well, any other thoughts on this chapter then?
No.
Yeah. I don't have any either, except to say I thought it was interesting. But I thought it was a good read. Very good because I mean these aren't people you talk about very often. A lot of times their names are kind of just taboo, right? You don't want to talk about Randolph and Calhoun, those evil, evil racist people who have nothing to say about the makeup of the country. They are important in some way. They did contribute to some line of thought and to very important debates at the time, and you can't just ignore them and pretend that they don't exist because then you're much the worse off if some of those ideas start coming back up, right? And they had some good thought mixed in with their defense of slavery. So it's a real mixed
Well,
bag.
I've said repeatedly, it's very important to study your enemy.
Mhm.
Like Patton said about Rommel famously after one of the battles. I read your book, because he read his book on tactics
Mhm.
and countermeasures. So you have to you almost I always say you should study your opponent's argument. You should know their argument better than your own,
Mhm.
because then you're prepared and then you know why they're wrong. And of course, sometimes you find, I'm not saying that about these guys, but you find out, oh man, I was wrong about that. Or
Yeah.
they're right about this part. Or boy, that's an interesting perspective. You should always study your opponent or your enemy or however you want to describe it. And you should always know their argument better than they do,
Yeah. I agree. I agree.
because then you know their weaknesses.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end things then, unless you have any other final thoughts.
No, I do not.
All right. Well, this has been season 14, episode 5 of Unlimited Opinions. I have been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.
You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.